presentation today, which is News, Truth, or Fiction, is being presented by the Madison Chenango Call to Action Education Group. And I'll just give you a little rundown as how our presentation is going to go. Our panelists are going to speak for 35 minutes, present, and then I'm told to engage us in conversation. So it seems like there couldn't be a better time for this presentation, although I keep saying that about every presentation we do because it just seems to be non-stop excitement. But with Cambridge Analytica and Spectrum News and Facebook and fake news out there, what's a person to do when you're trying to figure out what's real and not real? So we'll get into that today. I'm going to introduce our panelists. We've got Joshua Fennell, who's the head of research and instruction, associate professor, Colgate University Case Library, and Geyer Center for Information Technology. Will, is it Chipotle?
That's the Italian, yeah. Good.
Colgate University assistant professor of mathematics. Meg Worley, Colgate University associate professor of writing and rhetoric and film and media studies. And Travis Oliveira, who's the director of our own Hamilton Public Library. So without any further ado, go ahead.
We're going to start. Everyone see that okay?
Yeah. He's still in
We're entering an era in which our enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time, even if they would never say those things. So, for instance, they could have me say things like, I don't know, Killmonger was right, or Ben Carson is in the sunken place, or, how about this, simply, President Trump is a total and complete dipshit. Now, you see, I would never say these things.
Can you turn it
It's
up,
not a
please?
public address,
I think
but
this is the loudest it'll
someone else will
okay.
go.
Someone.
Sorry.
like Jordan Peele. This is a dangerous time. Moving forward, we need to be more vigilant with what we trust from the internet. It's a time when we need to rely on trusted news sources. It may sound basic, but how we move forward in the age of information is going to be the difference between whether we survive or whether we become some kind of fucked up dystopia. Thank you. Stay woke, bitches.
So we started with that video. Obviously, that's Jordan Peele's production company. He actually created that using Adobe After Effects and fake app, a face swapping technology. If anyone here uses Snapchat, as I'm looking at all of you, maybe you're Snapchat users, maybe not. It allows you to basically swap faces with someone. And so this video went viral, I think, about a month ago on BuzzFeed. And it basically kind of warns of perhaps a future to come where we might not even know if the person who is actually speaking is the person who is actually speaking. So something to be mindful of the problems of fake news and perhaps where we're headed. So to start off our conversation today, and since we're all nerdy academics, we thought it would be a good idea to at least start by defining some terms. These aren't necessarily set definitions, but these are some of the terms that I think have been bandied about the last few years. Sometimes interchangeably, and sometimes it's kind of hard to figure out what someone is talking about when they say alternative facts or fake news or even propaganda. So we'll start with definitions. So the first one, propaganda, and certainly propaganda isn't new by any means. So propaganda has been with us for quite some time, and this definition actually comes from Timothy Schneider, who recently published the book On Tyranny. So Timothy Schneider is a Yale historian, and he specializes in regimes in Eastern Europe. And he defines propaganda as not necessarily an argument, so not to convince someone that you are right, but to demonstrate that you have authority over the truth itself. And it makes sense, Timothy Schneider, the way he defined this, when many of us think of propaganda, we think of visual imagery, and then of course we also think of images like this on the left. And this example is coming from a French newspaper, by Herman Paul, and this was his criticism of the propaganda around the Boxer Rebellion in China in the late 1800s. Of course, you have Barbary on the left, civilization on the right, and the caption, if you can't read it, is, "It's all a matter of perspective. When the Chinese coolie strikes a French soldier, the result is a public cry of Barbary, but when a French soldier strikes a coolie, it's a necessary blow for civilization. One can think of propaganda today. There are arguments that modern day memes, so images that are shared visually on Facebook or Twitter, are kind of a modern day propaganda. So something to think about for our conversation. So to fake news, so the topic of the day. So defined as intentionally false news created for the purpose of getting someone to believe what one is saying is right, even if the producer knows that it's not true. So that delineates fake news from kind of parody, or so The Onion, for example. And on the left, the example here, fake news isn't new either. One could argue that fake news started in the 1800s under the auspices of yellow journalism. That's exactly what this image is referring to. So you have William Randolph Hearst on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side is Joseph Pulitzer. They're in their circulation war of newspapers in the late 1800s. And so William Randolph Hearst, of course, is famous for running the headline that the USS Maine was sunk by the Spanish, basically to foment the Spanish-American War at the late 1800s. In many ways, he's the godfather of yellow journalism insofar as he was using unethical manners for the purposes of journalism. So a definition for fake news to chew on for a little bit later. So modern terminology. So these are new. These are new within the last 5 years, unfortunately. Alternative facts. So this is a tough one to define, and I think we might have a conversation if there even is a definition of alternative facts. But so information that is provided to challenge the narrative created by facts that are hostile to one's preferred beliefs. And so you all chuckled, you obviously recognize Kellyanne Conway, that is who this is associated with. She famously went on Meet the Press to defend Sean Spicer's defense of the inauguration. I believe I have the quote that he gave. Trump's inauguration was, I quote, "the largest audience to ever witness an inauguration, period, both in person and around the globe." I should point out that Chuck Todd, who was interviewing Kellyanne Conway at the time, said, "Alternative facts are not facts, they are falsehoods." So in some ways you could define alternative facts as merely falsehoods, but something that we can talk about. And then two related to this, again, alternative facts are around feelings. Many will say we're entering a post-truth age. Post-truth, and this definition comes from Lee McIntyre. He's a professor of philosophy or a research fellow at Boston University, and actually just published a book in February of 2018 on MIT Press entitled Post-Truth. And he defines post-truth as the contention that feelings are more accurate than facts for the purpose of the political subordination of reality. And there are many examples you could think of using here. I actually chose this one. Does everyone remember Jenny McCarthy's crusade against vaccinations? So she was on the Oprah show, and she was basically putting herself in the public light, talking about the connection between vaccinations and autism. And when she was challenged to produce evidence by Oprah, she said, "My science is named Evan, and he's at home, that's my science." Her feeling that her child was diagnosed with autism because he was vaccinated was her proof. And perhaps more apropos, this happened later in the interview, when she was challenged even further to say, when she was asked where she got her information from, she responded to Oprah, "The University of Google is where I got my degree from." Now, I stick with this because in many ways, and McIntyre makes this argument in the book, and I think it's an important one to underscore, in many ways, the modern playbook for fake news, one could argue, actually starts with science denial. And science denial and the playbook for that, in a lot of ways, actually comes from the tobacco industry. Enjoy this trip down memory lane.
How often does your job call you out of bed in the middle of the night? Well, if you were a doctor, it would be often. And generally, there isn't much time to spare.
Coffee, doctor?
Oh, fine. I'm a cowboy, you love. Thanks. You know, this night work's kind of rough, isn't it? That's right. But a camel's always a pleasure. Yes, folks, the pleasing mildness of a camel is just as enjoyable to a doctor as it is to you or me. In a nationwide survey, doctors in all branches of medicine were asked, "What cigarette do you smoke, doctor?" The brand named most was Camel. Tens of thousands of doctors, general practitioners, surgeons, specialists, doctors in every branch
All
of
those.
medicine were involved. According to this nationwide survey, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette.
Indeed. Good catch.
Yeah.
So,
Tax stamp on it.
Yeah, I gotta get some now.
so it was at the Plaza Hotel in 1953 in which the basically tobacco execs gathered because a study was published basically connecting nicotine or cigarette tar to cancer in mice. And so tobacco executives gathered and decided what to do about this. And the result was a pretty strong PR firm. And then what they formed was called the Tobacco Industry Research Committee. They created this statement, a frank statement to cigarette smokers, you can see here. This was published in almost every newspaper in the country. And as you can see, I pulled out on the right how you can start to see some of the playbook for kind of modern alternative facts and modern fake news and also post-truth. You start to see the amplification of feelings over facts. You start to see sowing of discord among experts and even science itself. And then perhaps something Will might talk to a little bit later, the validity of the statistics themselves being questioned. This was 1953, and this was an extremely effective strategy. So much so that it wasn't until 1998 that the tobacco industry readily admitted that this was a PR scam, and they had known all along that tobacco caused cancer. And so it's a fascinating thing to look at, this tobacco research industry, and this is often referred to as the Tobacco Treaty. Because in 1998, right as the tobacco industry is actually starting to pay out billions of dollars of settlements, all of a sudden the Kyoto Protocol comes up. And the oil industry, the petroleum industry, has to figure out what to do about their linkage to climate change. So this is an American Petroleum Institute internal memo. This was actually leaked by the Union of Concerned Scientists. They basically use the exact tobacco treaty. And as you can see on the right-hand side, this is all pulled literal quotes. Victory will be achieved when we sow uncertainties in climate science amongst average citizens. You start to see the targeting of media, again, to sow discord among experts, create uncertainties. And then perhaps even more disturbing at the bottom is to those promoting the Kyoto Treaty and the basis of excellent science appear to be out of touch with reality. So I point these out because you can argue where fake news, alternative facts, and many of these things come from, but in many ways you can trace them back through science denial. And in fact, Lee McIntyre actually makes this case in Post-Truth. And to hit it home, when you think of our current administration, you can start to see the tobacco treaty run through our current administration. So I pulled this left quote here from Mike Pence. This is actually from his run for Congress in the early 2000s. He wrote a piece called The Great American Smokeout. And in it he says, despite the hysteria from the political class and the media, smoking doesn't kill. In fact, 2 out of every 3 smokers does not die from a smoking-related illness, and 9 out of 10 smokers do not contract lung cancer. So again, you're playing with statistics, you're starting to see some of the alternative facts, fake news. And of course, on the right, you have Scott Pruitt writing in the National Review, the whole sowing of discord among experts. Scientists continue to disagree about the extent of global warming. Now, I bring these 2 pieces up because I think they segue nicely into what Will is going to talk about, which is the idea that feelings matter more than numbers and facts. So I'm actually going to throw it to Will to talk about how to feel about numbers.
All right, so how to feel about numbers. So to start, we want to talk about the purpose of statistics. And it's really to measure things that are too big to measure. So if we wanted to talk about the proportion of smokers that die from lung cancer, it's really tough to get those statistics on all smokers because there are millions and millions and millions. And so statistics is used to generalize to a group based on a small sample of people. And so you'll see the first part here, right? We're trying to describe society. And this is generally evident. So if you turn on the news, so I watched NBC this morning for a few hours, and there were dozens of statistics, right? And they're generally, when you see them posted, they'll say, 30% of Democrats think that everybody has an equal chance to succeed in America. And then you say, well, they didn't talk to me, right? And so they talk to a smaller group of people. And so what they do is they'll talk to somewhere between 300 and a few thousand people, and then they'll generalize that to the group. Turns out these generalizations are pretty good, right? And they do a good job of describing society. And so the second part, and this is really the part we have to think about, is the hidden part. Why did somebody take it upon themselves to summarize this part of society? And it turns out there's a lot of different answers to that. So the White House does polls. There are different polling agencies, right? We have Gallup and Pew Research. And there are universities like Quinnipiac and Monmouth and a few others. And so the idea is this hidden layer, right? Why are we creating these statistics? Why do we feel the need to summarize society? Are we doing it to show that there's a problem, right? Are we doing it to show that we need to support a certain group? Or is there some other attribute in the background? And so when we start talking about numbers and we start talking about them more and more as data becomes more widely available, then we have to think about how we train people to consume that information, right? And so in school, we get history and we get math, and we get reading, writing, arithmetic, the whole song. But the idea is this new type of math, statistics, is just starting to increase in our elementary schools and high schools. And so right now we have a problem, right, with numeracy. Right? Numeracy is like literacy. And the idea is we have to think about what these numbers mean. So when somebody says 30% of Democrats approve, or 30% of Democrats think that everyone has an equal chance to succeed in America, what does that number mean, right? What group of people is that based on? How many people is that based on? And so we have to think about where the sources are coming from and what they mean in context of a full statistical problem. And so the things that we notice in the news when we talk about fake news or we talk about propaganda or we talk about one of the synonyms for fake news, right? We think about, well, where are the sources of it? And so sometimes it's somebody using purposefully fake information to try to sway somebody into thinking one way or the other. But a lot of times, it's somebody that's well-meaning, somebody that's trying to come up with convincing evidence for something they feel strongly about, but they're being so misleading as to be untrue. And so the idea is, part of statistics, part of describing society, is to try to get the full picture. And so it ends up being less often that somebody's fabricating data and straight out lying about what they're saying. But it turns out for a lot of the main problems in society, there are statistics that support both arguments. And so if we're talking to a certain group of people, we might get one result. If we're asking a question a certain way, we might get a certain result. And so what we want to do with statistics is ask where they came from, why they were created, and do they accurately describe what's happening in the background. And so I think the most compelling part of this is big numbers and surprising statistics spread quicker. And so there's actually recent research about how information spreads on Twitter. And it turns out that falsehoods, right, things that are spectacular, spread faster than the truth. And it's because they're surprising. And so these sorts of misgivings are exciting, and that makes for fun things to share on the internet, and exciting things to talk about on the news, and very clickable links, right, on your news feeds. And so media outlets favor disturbing statistics. The bigger a number is, the more exciting it is to talk about, the more compelling the news program is. And so what we do is we tend to look for those surprising statistics, and we'll talk about the surprising statistics more than we will the boring, true, well-intentioned statistics. And so in this case here, you'll see that the big statistics indicate a bigger problem, which will end up yielding more entertaining news. And so we're constantly looking to take the spectacle out of news, right? The idea is if you're reading something and you're saying, this sounds like the plot from a Netflix original series, right? You're just saying, maybe I should think about this a little bit further, right? Maybe this is compelling for the sake of being compelling and not compelling for the sake of being informative. And so finally, statistics that draw away attention from a problem or to a problem. So if somebody supports gun control, right, there's two ways to look at a problem, right? You support gun control, you don't, or you're apathetic, but let's say there's two, right? In this case, if I support gun control, a good statistic would be the number of children killed by guns in the United States, which is unfortunately very high, right? A bad statistic, something that would draw away from gun control, would be the number of people that defended themselves using guns, right? And so the idea is we have to think about the problem holistically. The idea is two people, one that supports gun control and one that doesn't, together debating the topic, will often talk past each other by talking about two different things, right? And the idea is I think we can all accept that any number of children killed by guns is bad, and I think that's a bipartisan feeling. The idea is that that's all we talk about, we're not really fully capturing the debate about guns. And the idea is the same the other way. And I've had conversations with people that are against gun control who will cite this statistic over and over again and say more people die from kitchen knives than rifles, which is a true statistic, but so misleading as to be untrue. And so we want to worry about, not necessarily about truth and fake news and lies and things like that, but part of fake news is not wholly describing the event. And so I have a fun video here, another throwback. This is a UK television show.
He's going to say something new and radical in the broadcast.
What, that silly grand design? Bernard, that was precisely what you had to avoid. How did this come about? I shall need a very good explanation.
Well, he's very keen on it.
What's that got to do with it? Things don't happen just because prime ministers are very keen on them. Neville Chamberlain was very keen on peace.
He thinks it's a vote winner.
Ah, that's more serious stuff. What makes him think that?
Well, the party have had an opinion poll done. It seems all the voters are in favour of bringing back national service.
Well, I have another opinion poll done showing the voters are against bringing back national service.
They can't be for it, I
Of
guess.
course they can, Bernard. Have you ever been surveyed?
Yes, well, not me, actually, my house. Oh, I see what you're
What happens? A nice young lady comes up to you. Obviously, you want to create a good impression. You don't want to look a fool, do you? So she starts asking you some questions. Mr. Willing, are you worried about the number of young people without jobs?
Yes.
Are you worried about the rise in crime among teenagers?
Yes.
Do you think there's a lack of discipline in our comprehensive schools?
Yes.
Do you think young people welcome some authority and leadership in their lives?
Yes.
Do you think they respond to a challenge?
Yes.
Would you be in favour of reintroducing national service?
Yes. Well, I suppose I might.
Yes or no?
Yes.
Of course you would, Bernard. After all you've told you can't say no to that. So, they don't mention the first 5 questions, they publish the last one.
Is that really what they do?
Well, not the reputable ones, no, but there aren't many of those. Alternatively, the young lady can get the opposite result.
How?
Mr. Willing, are you worried about the danger of war?
Yes.
Are you worried about the growth of armaments?
Yes.
Do you think that there's a danger in giving young people guns and teaching them how to kill?
Yes.
Do you think it's wrong to force people to take up arms against their will?
Yes.
Would you oppose the reintroduction of national service?
Yes.
Why, you see, Bernard, the perfect balanced sample. So, we just commission our own survey for the Ministry of Defence. See to it, Bernard.
So it's, of course, a very extreme example of misleading questions and trying to get answers from a particular poll. And so here, there's really 4 things to think about when consuming a statistic. And so quickly, who created the statistic? Why was the statistic created? How was the statistic created? What is it measuring? And is the statistic consistent with basic common facts? And so the idea behind statistics is we can measure things a lot of ways. And so there are a lot of ways to ask the question, right? We just saw 2 very extreme cases. And the idea is all of this is happening in the background. And so there's a website, Real Clear Politics, that will post dozens of polls asking similar questions. And what happens is when you go onto most news web pages and you read the headline, right, it's meant to make you click. It's supposed to be exciting. And sometimes you read through it and you go, well, it wasn't as exciting as the title sounded. And then you keep scrolling, and then 2 or 3 pages later, you get to the bottom, and there's 1 paragraph in italicized font with a link in it, and that has all of the information of how the question was asked, who it was asked to, and how it was measured. So you can see what questions were asked, what order they were asked in. You can see summaries about the samples. And so something that happened in the 2016 election, Nate Silver, a fellow statistician, was eviscerated for giving Donald Trump a 25% chance of winning the presidency, right? Which we would think about, 25% doesn't sound like a lot, right? And if the idea is 25% is if you flip a coin twice and it lands on heads both times. If we all did that right now, chances are a good portion of us, roughly 1/4 of us, would flip a coin and have it land on heads twice. And so the idea is 25% isn't all that unusual, even though it sounds like a small number. And he was eviscerated for this. And the idea was, his basis for that argument was that polls oversampled Democrats. And so if you scroll to the bottom of those news articles that says poll up, Hillary's up 12 points, and you scroll to the bottom, you can see who they asked that question to. And it turns out that very often, right, a lot of these polls are done by random digit dial. And so they have acceptable numbers that are not on the do not call list, and they randomly dial phone numbers, and they talk to people on the phone. And the question is, who's home? Who's answering the phone? And so you'll find a lot of these polls are biased in a lot of different ways. And so the question could be, well, how does Donald Trump have a 46% approval rating from Rasmussen and a 30% approval rating from a Monmouth University poll? And the answer is they weight the responses differently. So they don't just call 500 people and report the average. Some people they call count for 4 or 5 people. And they do that to try to match the demographics of the country. And you'll see there are polls about Americans versus likely voters. And those two groups are very different. And so you might look at the support rate for Donald Trump across Americans is very low, and against likely voters is much higher. And so the Rasmussen poll is based on likely voters. And so the idea is you'll find the likely voter polls are higher because not everybody votes. And so the idea is scroll down to the bottom of the news article and click on that link and see who they're actually talking about. And so with that, there's a quote by a comedian, Tim Minchin, and this is in a graduation address, which is absolutely wonderful if you're looking for an hour to waste. He says, most of society's arguments are kept alive by a failure to acknowledge nuance. We tend to generate false dichotomies and then try to argue one point using 2 entirely different sets of assumptions, like 2 tennis players trying to win a match by hitting beautifully executed shots from either end of separate tennis courts. And so I created this little image over here. But that's where we're going with, right? When we talk about fake news, sometimes it's not lies. Sometimes it's just only focusing on the part that you agree with and ignoring the positive parts of other people's arguments. And so the idea here is sometimes fake news is just not interpreting the whole story. And so with that, I'll pass it on to Meg.
Okay, thank you. I hope you don't mind. I'm going to stand up, partly because I'm shorter than these guys, but also so I can gesticulate wildly without hitting Travis and Will. Also, so I can look at the slides at the same time that you do. Is that okay with the camera? I promise to stand still, except for my arms. So, media bias and rhetorical cues and clues. Let's see if I've... So, everybody has a copy of this chart. I didn't realize that you would all be getting them, but Josh very kindly made printouts. I realized that the writing is very, very small, and the information is incredibly dense. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But this is a really handy chart because everything that I've scrutinized, and I'm a natural skeptic. I tend to think, where are they wrong? I'm sure I can catch them being wrong about something. In fact, this seems pretty accurate. And one of the things that I think is particularly entertaining is that the National Enquirer, which I think we were all brought up to loathe and look down upon, solidly there in the middle. It's crap, but it's neutral crap. So, one of the things about this is the 3rd generation of this chart. And you can find it, well, it's available at mediabiaschart.com, but also, Will will enjoy this, at a site called allgeneralizationsarefalse.org. And it's a statistician who has come up with this. She's got an algorithm and she can explain it to you at tiresome length if you're interested. The earlier version of this looked like this. And this is, it's a much simpler chart. It doesn't have all the same media sources on it. It doesn't have the boxes. It only has the ovals and circles. It also is good. I bookmarked it the moment it came out about 5 years ago. Simpler to read, still good information. These sorts of things, there are a number out there. This one made the biggest hit when it first came out, but a number of people have tried to make similar kinds of charts, and it's really important to kind of look over them and see if they jive with your sense of things. Obviously, you always want to be kind of scrutinizing your own bias. My bias, let's see, is NPR? Yeah, NPR is solidly in the middle here, but in the previous one, NPR is over a little bit further to the left. So I tend to check all these charts against my own bias. There are right-wing versions of these where everything is kind of flipped. It's kind of amazing how so NPR is labeled as unanalytical, and here it's somewhere at analytical, verging on complex. So these sorts of sites can be really useful. And the next thing that I wanted to talk about, and I realized that we said we would take 35 minutes and we're hitting on 33, so I will be quick. Classic, but I'm blaming you. Travis and I are off the hook.
You just cut me off completely.
No, you're the payoff.
I am?
Yes, I've seen your slides, buddy. He's the payoff. So I'm in the Department of Writing and Rhetoric, and Will has talked, and certainly Josh has, and I know that Travis has a kind of list of things to look for, but they're so rhetorical clues that often will cue you into the fact that something is probably not giving you a straightforward version of things. Those, I think most of us have gotten a few pieces of spam in our email box at some point or another. I have yet to find the piece of spam that doesn't have a typo or grammatical error in it. It is amazing to me. At the university, about once every 6 weeks, we get an alert that there's been a phishing message, and look out for this message. And I look at it, and every single time it has a mechanical error in it. Which is not to say that everything with a mechanical error is spam or fake news, in the same way that not everything that's surprising is not truth, as Will kind of implied, but he's a better logician than I promise. These are a few things that I think are worth pointing out. Typos, also oddly informal grammar. So if something seems like it's supposed to be news, but it seems like it's written by a 13-year-old who can't quite judge the audience, that's a sign. There are lots of words that kind of skew things. One person might say influence, another might say manipulative. Things that are particularly pejorative in something that pretends to be news probably isn't. Likewise, judgmental words like amazing and appalling. Those are things that shouldn't show up in a straight, newsworthy article that is abiding by the traditional norms of journalism, which developed as a result of the yellow journalism of the 1900s, as Josh talked about. Also, argument by assertion. This was something that my father would accuse me of when I was a child. He would say, "You're not giving me a reason, you're just saying it over and over and over again." That is argument by assertion, and that is not argument. That is bad reasoning. So just looking for some kind of warrant and claim to support things. So saying, this is why you should believe this. Those are a few things in terms of the words. Then there's the visuals. So decorative typefaces. There are two kinds of typefaces. One is called book hands, and those are for reading in blocks of text. Any book you open will be in a book hand. Then there are decorative ones that are meant for headlines and big splashy signs and so forth. So decorative typefaces are a giveaway that something is not right here. And I have some examples. Unflattering photos of people. We probably mostly remember the picture of O.J. Simpson in the late 90s, was it? I don't know why I'm looking at you two. In the late 90s, where his face was darkened when it was the Time magazine cover, I think, where his face was darkened. I didn't bring a bunch of slides to talk about this, but recognizing the signs of photo manipulation is a nice tool to develop. But when they use unflattering photos of people, you know that's the equivalent of using the word appalling or amazing. Ads for unexpected items. It's hard to go anywhere online these days without finding ads. Even ad blocker will not block everything. But if it's giving you ads for things that you weren't aware of existing, especially the kinds of things that would shock your mother, if it's giving you these weird ads for products that you really don't want to think about, that's a sign. It's amazing how often I'll see, whoa, I didn't know that existed, and I didn't want to see that. I go to the next page. It's just a giveaway for me. And last of all, the color coding. It tends to be that, well, the fake news sites that I've looked at, and I'm not just saying the conservative sites, I believe very strongly in supporting conservative journalism of quality. We need both sides. If we were all bedwetting Bolsheviks like me, the world would go to hell in a handbasket. But we need responsible journalism on the right. So this is not just about responsible right-wing publications. It tends to be the irresponsible ones that skew toward just red and blue, and particularly blue and black, which you may be familiar are the colors of the Tea Party flag. So when things are kind of coded blue and black, that should be a kind of bell for warning in your head. So for my examples, let's start with this one. Can I zoom in here? Is there a way to zoom in? Because they don't have a copy of this, but I want to point out something that made me skeptical of this chart in the beginning. Oh, well.
PowerPoint?
No, it's in a Google slide.
Well, I guess we can't zoom in. But what I want to point out, oops, I've got a little,
Yeah, sorry. Trying to get it larger.
oh well,
Never mind.
we should have worked this out before.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Oh,
We can go
hey, now
back.
we're really zoomed in.
It zooms everything
Oh,
else.
just reverse. Sorry.
Okay.
That will go away.
So here, along there, and along here, that font is Comic Sans. Who on earth thought it would be good to make a chart about media literacy using Comic Sans?
Programmers.
Don't get me started. Don't get me started. When I first saw this, I thought this can't be serious because of the use of Comic Sans. Another thing, using the more modern one, I mentioned that this was very information dense. One of the things, this is all very, very hard to read. These labels, they overlap one another, very problematic. The less legible something is, the easier it is to be misleading. So when you see something that seems to be engineered to be illegible, be suspicious. And this sets off my bells, this particularly. The other thing that sets off my bells about this whole chart is the circles and the squares, because they imply hard lines. They imply some kind of boundary over which something changes. And none of this is boundaries. A third thing that Will might appreciate particularly is that it has two x-axes, in the top and the bottom, and it seems to have two y-axes. Y-axis down here, this is actually the key, but it's arranged as if it's a second y-axis. So somebody who is looking for a simple chart is going to find this, and it would be really easy. I would not be surprised at all if somebody, by the end of this talk, wadded this up and threw it in the trash on their way out. Now, I'm not saying that I could do it better, but this has a lot of the hallmarks of information illiteracy. So I think I will stop there and hand things over to...
Can we get this slide from the same source as this?
Yes, you can.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. I'll hand it over to Travis.
Okay. Thank you.
Here's the magic wand.
All right, let's see how this works. All right, so why am I here, I guess is the question that I keep asking myself. So I guess since I've discovered working, being a public library director, it's just one thing after another of things that I didn't sign up for that I'm not qualified to handle. So this information literacy is just another one. You know, whenever somebody comes in with a question about their Kindle Fire, I have no idea what the answers are, but we have to find them quickly. And similar to that, whenever somebody has a question, it might not necessarily be about something that's fake news related, but we might have to find out the answer and kind of guide them the right way. Librarians have been attempting to fix this problem by going out and doing talks and making people aware of this. And the bigger organizations have put together instruction pamphlets on how to handle this, which I'll share some of that information with you today. And before this, we didn't have a presence on our website to deal with anything related to this topic, but in doing this talk now we have a web page that has some helpful hints on how to navigate the confusing internet that we all have to deal with. So this was pulled from BuzzFeed, which according to this chart is skews liberal and also unfair interpretations of the news. So depending on your interpretation of that, I think the statistic here is still, it should be accurate from what I could find. And I'll show you the checklist that I went through to determine whether this was true or not. And it checked out to be mostly true. I don't know for sure what they were basing everything on. But that shows a little bit of what you see on a daily basis on the internet. I don't access scholarly journals as much as I should, but coming from dealing with the public every day, it's important to deal with things the same way that they would. So I do tend to base my sources around the evil Google searches, but in knowing how to deal with a good Google search, I think is important to remember. So again, this is from the ALA website. So it is our responsibility to fact check and to be accurate. We deal with things that the public might not be aware of. There are basically book propaganda being sent to us by publishing companies, which I assume is being funded by super PACs, that are just sent to librarian at such and such institution that we have to determine what to do with. That's not something that we talk about, but that happens once a month or so. We get a strange sounding book from a source that we didn't know. So it's important to question even things like that as they come into the building and to see if this will be helpful to the public or will it be harmful, and where did it come from. So I wish I saved one to show you because one came in about 2 weeks ago. But they're not fun. That one was clearly propaganda on one side. The other issue I'll speak on briefly is that of misinformation leading to extreme viewpoints. We've had numerous instances since I've been the director of this library of people dropping off white supremacist propaganda in the library. And so this is something that we should tackle. I think a lot of that stems from bad information. So there's a lot of work still to be done. So this is just another part of that. So here's the most important, meatiest thing that I could find from IFLA, which I have to look up what it says every time, on how to spot fake news. So I decided to take this graphic and hold it up to a mirror and see if it checks out. So the source was the International Federation of Library Associations, which I found on Google. So I had to do a little research to find out if they were for real. And it seemed like they were. I was very interested in what they had to say. So at least if they were fake, they were really elaborate. And swayed me to the point of thinking that they were real. There was a lot about conferences and other less interesting to non-librarian things. This wasn't something that I thought was clickbait. It was rather difficult to find and buried. It's not one of their main mission statements, although they do say that it's really important, and this is published in 10 different languages, I think, on that site. There's not much more of the story about that. The author was just IFLA staff. And I looked at a couple more pages. There was a lot of IFLA staff published on that website because it's an organization that isn't necessarily linked to any person. As far as the links go, that all checked out too. The date that it was published, it was about February 28th this year. Was the last time it was updated, not necessarily the first day it was published, but at least it was changed recently. It's definitely not a joke, unless Josh did the whole website as a goof. He's really the only one that could have pulled it off because he asked me to do this presentation, maybe knowing that I would go to this webpage randomly. I don't know, but it seems like a bit of a dry situation. As far as biases go, I am pretty biased against this, but at the same time, it's a very unbiased approach to anything. There's nothing on this site that skews left or right. It just skews towards more accurate news. As far as asking the experts, I guess that's why we're here today, so that doesn't really check out. But I think it's still a good thing to have. And this graphic is on our website now. So if you go to hamiltonlibrary.org, and I think it's under resources, there's a page called Literacy Information, which has this and a video supporting this, if perhaps this explanation wasn't enough. So where to get good information? You can go to the newspaper, I think, is my favorite, because it takes you out of that internet bubble. Oh, sorry, if anybody wanted to read the fun thing that's written there, that's from the Unbeatable Squirrel Girl comic book that I was reading. But I thought it was pretty accurate. So you'll want to try different news outlets. I know maybe some people in this room don't want to watch Fox News, but it might be helpful to go to NPR, NBC, read the newspaper, and watch Fox News. I know you all have so much time to do all these things, but I find reading the newspaper, it helps to see so many different points of view, and not just what would come up in my news feed on Facebook, because you do create that bubble for yourself, and being able to recognize that and step away from it is really important. Verified social media accounts, so with a little blue check mark, which I didn't quite line up correctly. It looked good before it was published. And I think getting that to look on the slide the way it does takes longer than getting a verified Twitter account. Although I can't speak on that because the HPL Twitter account is still unverified. And then the websites that I find most helpful in debunking fake news with my Facebook friends are Snopes.com and PolitiFact. FactCheck.org is also very good, but it's not one that I personally go to. I just kept finding that within my research as the other one. There's a few other sites out there, but those are pretty reputable and neutral.
Excuse me, what was the second one? Was it PolitiFact?
PolitiFact.
Okay.
What they do is they take a quote from someone and they determine, I think the highest level of lie is called pants on fire or truth, and anywhere in between. So if somebody says something, they take that and look at everything and determine its truthiness, to use that fun word. All right, so here's Abraham Lincoln saying, don't believe everything you read on the internet just because there's a picture with a quote next to it. Keep that in mind. Memes are really dangerous. As Josh mentioned earlier, I can create a meme very easily, and if I can do it, then anybody can do it. I have no desire to make a meme, but it's come up a few times, and it's very simple. And that's not exactly the height of technology, but it's still dangerous because it does, a picture of someone does lend a little bit more weight. If it's someone that you admire or a movie that you like, you're more likely to look at it than you would just text. And as far as Google goes, the algorithms are meant to drive ad revenue. Keep that in mind when you're doing a Google search. But also biased search terms, which is a little bit further down the list. Sorry, I'm pointing, but I think there's a thing. I don't want to turn it off. Keep in mind what you're searching for, you might be biased towards. So I can't think of an example off the top of my head. I wrote one down somewhere, but I'm not going to look at that right Personal Facebook posts are usually the most unreliable sources, and in the last week since doing this, I saw two fake news items, one of which I'll share with you on the next slide. But unverified social media accounts retweeting something that might be from somebody who's not who they say they are happens quite often too. And Wikipedia, as we all know, is a crowdsourced information site, which is helpful, but can be dangerous because there's a big lack of attribution on there. So this happened this week. It says 4/25/2018. I had a friend of mine share the second picture with the caption saying, "I'm never gonna," or "They've just lost my business forever." Now, In-N-Out Burger, which I thought it was strange that someone would put this on a cup. Maybe it was retaliation from a disgruntled employee or something. But I already know that In-N-Out Burger, they actually print Bible verses like John 3:16 on the underside of the cups. The original picture is on the left, the photoshopped image is on the right. Having that knowledge, I was able to spot it a lot quicker because I thought that since the owner does that, I think there's 3 verses that keep coming up on the underside of their cups. It's strange to make that choice as a business owner, but they have every right to do so. I won't get into that right now. But it was determined to be false. There was a whole Snopes article about it. It actually got really popular when Weird Al Yankovic shared the image on his Twitter account about 5 years ago. So this is an old image that somehow cropped into this guy's feed, and he decided to share. So I posted the Snopes article underneath, and he promptly deleted the post. So that was a big win for me, I guess, if you want to call it that. But I don't think they have to worry about him not going there since they're a West Coast chain. It's very rare that he would have visited In-N-Out Burger. You had something you wanted to add about this?
Can I
Sure.
have the magic wand?
Absolutely.
So, and I am from California, so I have eaten it in and out many times, despite Bible verses. Even without that, I spotted this immediately because the lining up of the H and the N, they are not congruent with the curve of the cup. So if you look carefully, you can see this was photoshopped. It doesn't work right. If that was actually printed on there compared to here, where it lines up perfectly with the curve of the cup, here the vertical doesn't line up with the curve. So, as I was saying earlier.
Definitely something to keep in mind. And I didn't go into detail about spotting Photoshop. There's a lot of really good articles written about how to spot a Photoshop job. So maybe we can put that on our website. Please look at that website. Tell me if there's anything that you would add, because it's really in its infancy right now. But I think that's my last slide. Yeah. So that concludes my part of the presentation as far as I know.
And now we can throw it open to Q&A or discussion.
Why don't the 4 of you, and you're all younger than I am, I'm 83, just give us your concept of the brief history of the demise of the daily newspaper going back to, what was it, the 90s, early 90s maybe, because I think it's a shame that we don't have a good old-fashioned newspaper. In fact, a lot of cities used to always have 2. Now there's 1, and that 1 is often controlled by some biased thoughts either way. So does anybody have any comments on the possible comeback of the newspaper?
Made it a different way. Yeah. So there's a lot of pay for services now. So you can for the current generation who won't pick up a newspaper and read it, but will read the newspaper on their phone, they do have different services. And so I think you can do it for all the major newspapers like Wall Street Journal, New York Times. The local newspapers, it's tougher because they don't have the resources to set up something like that. But that is at least something now that's being tested by the bigger players in newspapers.
But when you talk about young people, and I'm fairly active up on the Hill as an alum and a crazy volunteer, but I see these young people with their devices, and after talking to many of them in various classes and things, I find out when they look at this, they're getting just snippets. And when you ask them about the the whole story. They just tell you just a snippet that they learned.
Yeah.
That's where the whole society there is losing attraction.
Information by headlines.
Yes.
So I was on a panel about the death of newspapers about 15 years ago in California. And in general, and it was a panel where I was the only academic, everybody else was in journalism. And nobody was very cheerful, including me. And there are many ways in which our notion of organizing information, and Travis and Josh probably know this better than I do, our notion of organizing information has changed drastically. Instead of browsing the shelves to find a book, the younger generation, and sometimes the older generation, looks things up online, and browsing is no longer playing the part that it used to. But I have 2 points of hope. One is that the journalists at the table in that panel said the one thing that everybody wants on paper that is not successful online, and I still believe this is true, is the crossword puzzle. And you notice how newspapers are generating more and more puzzles? It's because that's something everybody wants on paper. So that's one tidbit of hope. The other bit of hope that I can offer is that I ask my students this every year. Do you prefer to read a PDF of something, or do you prefer it on paper? To a person, they always say they would rather read on paper. They far prefer it. But finding a printer that's working and, being near the printer, whereas they just, 5 minutes before class, they pull up the PDF on their phone, whatever it is. For convenience, PDF is there, but even today's 17-year-olds prefer to read on paper. And they have grown up entirely in a digital era. So if they still prefer to read on paper, maybe there's something to that paper thing.
I'd like to comment about Google Play News that I read, and I find that I click on things that I don't really want to read at the moment to make sure that that subject stays current. But what surprised me was that Play News has the Colgate Maroon news in it. So all the way down to the local level, you can get news about what's going on on campus.
But it doesn't have the Mid-York Weekly.
Well, I don't know.
Could you explain what Google Play News is?
It's an app that you can have on your tablet or your phone, and they aggregate news from everything. So I follow Formula One, so I get Formula One news. Right now it's about the best source because it then links out to the various automobile websites that have news about Formula One. So I find it a very useful source, and it includes the Post-Standard and maybe not New York yet, but it does have Oneida, the OD.
I wanted to ask a question about Sinclair News and the notion of what is almost in disguise for most of us, and that is we see things that say CBS local news or NBC local news without really knowing the organization of that. And this seems to me to become a more dangerous piece as we move into the future. The question of what we can do to challenge that monopoly.
Look at me.
Yeah.
Just like any other media conglomerate, it's dangerous, but we are aware of it, but sometimes we're not aware until afterwards. So making choices after you find out what happened with Sinclair News, I think is important, but that might also lead you to question what other sources you consume and going forward.
To me, the danger there is that it seems playful, innocuous, not a major source, and that it may be what millions of people are watching without having a sense of where it falls on this chart.
Yeah.
I also kind of wonder when you see national news items on the local news, whether they're being selected.
Actually, let's continue that a little bit, because Harvey used the word that wasn't used much in your presentation, aggregate. The problem is that many of the online sources that you get do that. They are news aggregators. So, just as you in the personal level can have somebody start a tweet or a Facebook post and then it just mushrooms from there, it can also happen in any of these sites that you see here, the BuzzFeeds or the HuffPost and all that kind of stuff. If the information is incorrect, it still spreads to sources that you think are news sources because you've gotten good news from them before. It's not Harvey's opinion, but in fact it may have started out as something like that. Or a simple misprint or typo in there becomes all of a sudden you've got 50 people who are doing something, I don't know, as opposed to one.
And the correction pieces are not nearly as shared as the original mistakes, and so it does create a big issue.
And that's been going on ever since the invention of the wire services back in, which I think the wire services, the history of them starts during World War I, I believe, is that right? Okay. I don't know why I'm looking at you, but you usually know these things. And think of the famous picture, I probably just have to do this to,
Yeah.
You're thinking of Harry Truman, right? And that started with one wire service mistake, went everywhere, and the next thing you know, Dewey was president. So it's not, I mean, the only thing that I can, and this is pie in the sky thinking, but the only thing I can hope for is that we've had ways to balance out these dangers in the past, and we may be in a yellow journalism moment that we have a renewal. I know I'm being an idealist here, but maybe we will have a kind of renewal of journalism expectations the way that the Pulitzer-Hearst War gave rise to a kind of code of journalistic ethics. Maybe we'll have another one sometime.
Yeah, for most people, Google is the default browser, but there are other ones. I use DuckDuckGo, and they claim not to be economically driven. And I didn't know if you had any more information on other browsers or any information on that.
Yeah, you're all looking at me like.
Yes.
I was looking at Will.
Yeah,
I was waiting for you to mention Wolfram.
Oh, yeah.
So there are a lot of different search engines. There are probably hundreds, and there are a lot of extensions you can download in Chrome as well. And so I know we were talking about one that
BS detector.
yeah, it's called BS detector, and the idea is you can go through it, and it uses different things, but they're all using. The hard part about teaching a computer to read is that you can't teach a computer to read, and part of it is all of those tools are using indicators based on historical. So they might find a lot of different fake news articles and feed it into a system to find out what's common to these things, right? Maybe it's the color or the font or the use of hyperbole, and the idea is that I can try to help point out fake things. And the idea is we really don't have a good way of deciding whether or not something is fake without really looking into it ourselves. And so, for me, one of the things is no matter which search engine you use, it's automated. You're going to find something that's wrong with it somewhere. And so I think the best, cause for action is to think about how we consume the news. And the idea is, I tend not to trust anything unless I've confirmed it from 3 or 4 other places and believe it myself. And so the idea is it's hard because you can watch Fox News, and I think this is on, if you have Netflix, you can watch the new David Letterman show. President Obama was the first guest, and one of the famous quotes from that interview is, if you watch Fox News and you watch NPR, it's like 2 different worlds, right? They cover the same material in such a vastly different way. And so the idea is, and it's tough to know, right? Some of it isn't fake. It's just you're viewing it, what is the lens here? It's a misleading info, right? Or selective or incomplete stories. And the idea is it tends to be unfair because you completely eliminate somebody else's point of view by just presenting one side of the story. And so I think it almost has to be preventative rather than finding the best tool.
So you don't think Facebook is going to be successful in weeding out fake news?
It depends on how you define successful. So, can they get rid of a lot of it? Yes. Will they ever get rid of all of it? No.
And Facebook is never going to stop my friend Dorothy from posting the most ridiculous pieces from other days. I mean, our friends are part of our friends, at least those of us who are on Facebook and share information with each other, our friends are part of our sources. And I have a prime fake news source in Dorothy.
Yeah, don't unfriend them, don't unfollow them, keep following them and correcting them in front of everybody they know. They might choose to block you though. No guarantees there.
That's where the rhetoric comes in.
So this chart is 95% national in the sense that I really only see two sources, The Guardian and the Daily Mail. There may be a couple of others that are headquartered beyond the U.S. And I wonder about, the United States has maintained international propaganda services for decades, and other countries have as well. But this is an era where other countries' fake news is feeding pretty strongly into U.S. media. And I follow. You should all follow, if you can bear it. Follow RT on your on Facebook to see the way the Russian propaganda machine is spinning international stories, and including stories about American politics. But there must be many of these coming from many places, and how can we possibly begin to kind of put up barriers of skepticism when there's also international, very sophisticated, well-funded international sources doing that, entering this zone?
Nancy, doesn't the Financial Times have an editorial page, or is it all straight finance?
Oh, no,
It is
it's
news.
news. Yeah.
Okay.
So I was talking about Russian, RT, not FT, but RT.
No, I'm talking about, when you
Russia.
talked about
Yeah.
Financial
Sure,
Times
sure,
is supposed to be a very good source of information.
But I think I'm talking about where not the clearly editorial, but the news sources that are, if you follow RT, Russia Today, they post every single day as news, very subtly, sophisticatedly spun global stories. And if you weren't really skeptical, you'd buy them because they're very, very well done.
Well, that comes back to the preventative part. And the idea is that there's no way to stop somebody from selectively talking about one part or talking about it in a very tilted way, in a way that's not entirely false, but so misleading as to be untrue. And it's hard to, I think they do a very good. I agree. This is a very domestic news chart, and I think it'd be interesting to see what it's like across the world too. And I think.
But many sources across the world have long labeled themselves so that you know the Daily Telegraph is right wing and you know the Guardian is left. And we work in a slightly different world in terms of not calling ourselves out in terms of what the perspectives are.
I have to wonder about the historical component of the development of Cold War, and Nancy, you would know more about this than probably the four of us combined. The development of the Cold War rhetoric of propaganda. Because the propaganda of my childhood, occasionally, in 5th grade, we had a whole unit on propaganda. And we read some Russian newspaper that was translated into English. And it was so blatant. It was, president has syphilis and this, that, and the other. And it was all it was so exaggerated that it would just kind of set off our warning bells immediately. And it's much more sophisticated now. The Mail has always been spinning codswallop. All this time it's been publishing that kind of stuff. The New York Post, and we've had those organs in the United States just as much as they have in England, and probably every country. So that stuff has always been with us. I wish I had more historical understanding of the growth of finesse. And I don't know where that's going to take us. I have no answer. I hope that our reading abilities and the sources that we can use to wield skepticism wisely. I'm hoping that some kind of response to that finesse will develop, but, you know, I'm not developing anything right now. I don't know how that would go.
I was wondering about journalism schools, current, and what they teach, as far as teaching their students who are going to go out and be journalists, about all these different directions they could go and what the options are. Did any of you know anything about that?
Well, I have a bachelor's in journalism from 2009, so it's a little, even at that point, it's still stale, because none of this was happening in 2009. But they do teach ethics. That was one of the first courses that I took, and a responsibility. I think on an individual basis, journalists feel the need to accurately portray what's happening. Now, the company that owns the newspaper might try to get them to write about something else, but it's still an individual reporting issue. But that's for the ones that are paid. So if you get somebody writing for a website that's a startup, then who knows what they're doing and what kind of training they've had. But if you hire somebody that went to journalism school, they usually are pretty honest and at least open about their opinions if they tell you them.
And I think the payment thing is a big piece of that puzzle, that so many of the articles that we read, people were paid $25 for. The demise of professional journalism seems right there alongside this. And I did want to say, Josh worked really hard to get a journalist to be on that panel, but we couldn't get anybody.
I'm close.
You are. That's why I was trying to say that. And back in the back, we have.
Yeah, my question was about the comparison of integrity between, say, the paper source. I don't want to say it with the New York Times, but I'm thinking about, because I know someone whose name has appeared in Forbes.com, but maybe Forbes print has a lot more integrity as far as who gets in as far as the authors of their stories. But then you'll go, and I've been a subscriber of The Week magazine, but then you go on their website and some of the things that someone could click on, and it's just, what are you getting? You're not getting the same animal, are you? And why do they allow that to happen if they're a journalistic source?
I mean, this is the point where my partner would say, I share your concerns about late capitalism. I feel like that's the answer to so many of these
It
things.
just feels so misleading when you trust a print publication and then you go on their website and they could have some authors that are just paid by the hour to pump out an article, to fill the site.
Exactly, and those are, students who have just graduated with a degree in creative writing, not to dismiss creative writing. Right. You should all, by all means appreciate creative writing, but people who have some experience writing that is not relevant to the truth industry. And so they're writing for BuzzFeed, and I've a number of my former students are doing that kind of thing, or start out doing that kind of thing and gradually decide, there's no money in this, I'm never going to make a living at this. And so they get another job. And I think that a lot of the sites actually do trade on that. They're using students right out of school to, paying them $25 or $50 an article, and that's not journalism. That's writing, but not journalism.
And I think the reason is that websites have a tremendous demand for fresh content. Mm-hmm. A news website especially, they want to continue to fill pages with new things, and of course the quality has to go down.
Click-worthy things.
Yeah, and CNN headline news has really conditioned our expectation of the news. It used to be that, when I grew up, there were two newspapers. The Journal was Democrat, the News Sentinel was Republican, and you'd get news in the morning, and that's what had happened since the previous night, and there was news in the evening, and it was a 12-hour news cycle at best. 24 was more realistic. Now we expect something new every 30 minutes.
It's always breaking.
And it's always breaking.
breaking.
Until we are broken. Yes.
I just want to add something to what you just said. which is there does seem to be different ethics or completely lack of ethics when it comes to or standards. I guess that's the word. There's a lack of standards when it comes to websites. So I live in Syracuse. We get the Post Standard. Some people call it Post Substandard. So if you send a letter to the editor to be printed in the newspaper, you have to send it with a name, an identifying name, and an address, and maybe your phone number too, and if they won't print it otherwise. On the other hand, if you want to comment on an article, and you can comment all you like, 500 times that day if you like, you don't even have a name, you just have some, web handle.
I think what
and you can put on, as long as you don't actually put in swear words, it'll stay.
I think the point that you're making is very important, and the idea is that not only are the comments anonymous, but I think 20 years ago, there were a handful of people that read the news, right? And it is you had the famous people, and now that it's 24 hours a day, it's a different person every hour, and so there's less of that, and maybe it's a romanticizing the past, but I think there used to be news people that were revered for being news people.
Cronkite,
Yeah.
Everybody adored Cronkite.
Exactly. There were names that everyone knew, and people that were revered for telling the truth and for having that level of integrity.
Integrity,
now,
there's that word. I haven't heard that yet.
Well, there is a kind of impeachment of authority going on, and I think that my own field has something to do with it, my own field writ large. English, literature, rhetoric, media studies, we have encouraged people to put more emphasis on their own interpretations, think for yourself, read for yourself, don't just take down notes from your Shakespeare professor the way I did. I wrote down what he said, and then I barfed it all back up in a paper, and I made an A+. And we've moved away from that model. So authority doesn't mean the same thing it does to a generation that's coming through school now as it did to somebody who was coming through school 100 years ago. And there's no Eric Severide anymore. I mean, of course, everybody's been accused of sexual harassment in the news industry. There's so much going on. Authority doesn't mean what it used to.
And that's a tremendously important, interesting place to go. But where we have not gone at all is to the Cambridge Analytica side of things. That is fake news that is engineered by major sources and that is not within the conversation of the BuzzFeed student who's a creative writer. I mean, that's a whole other piece to this that we better be paying attention to because it's entering our lives in major ways.
Yeah, and Cambridge Analytica is a big, right? So they were the firm that was behind Brexit and then also involved with the Trump campaign. And I think
in campaigns in Nigeria.
And not just that. I think the interesting part is it's sort of been sensationalized as a news story. I think Facebook gets a lot more of the blame than they deserve, in the sense that it wasn't up to Facebook. It happened whether Facebook liked it or not. But one of the things that we don't think about, and this kind of goes back to the Google Play News, is that the way we use our cell phones and the way we use the internet, it's all tracked, right? And the idea is to Google your user number 5 and have all of your information. And it's astonishing the predictions that they can make about you based on what you search, the music you listen to, the videos you watch on YouTube,
what you type in your
emails, and it really gives away what is most compelling to you. And so for a firm like Cambridge Analytica to come along and have that data, they can really pinpoint accuracy, show you what you need to see to make that. If you're an undecided voter, and that's where they were going. They were trying to find the people that were on the fence, that weren't necessarily going to show up on election day, and try to show them exactly what they needed to see to be pushed, to be compelled to go do that. And that is terrifying. right? The idea is if you have that much information available about you, and it wasn't readily available to them, but when you're on Facebook and you download one of those apps and that button comes up, do you want to share this, 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 and this with this app? A lot of people just click yes and keep going. I think there was what company was it did a joke where they said like you sign your soul away to us by clicking you agree. No one reads that stuff. And the idea is we're really willfully giving away all of this information. And you know, there's no output either. So the idea is if you're using something and it's free, you're the product, not the customer. And so the idea is, one of the
friends.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
No, I mean, only a small portion of the people were voluntarily giving their information.
So the Cambridge Analytica, no one willfully gave their information to Cambridge Analytica. Right. Everyone willfully gave their information to the app, and the app, the guy that had the app and sold the data, he should be on the news every night.
Yeah.
And they should be eviscerating him every day.
Right.
And so, yeah.
But even your normal use, if you're looking for news or information on given subjects, Google is collecting that in order to feed ads to you. And same thing for all the things you buy online are feeding into databases that feed ads back to you, hoping that you'll click on them, which is worth maybe 1/10 of a cent to the clickee, or they're just an ad that you might actually pay attention to.
Yeah, there are a lot of stories like that. There's the story where, I think with the dad got an email congratulating him on the new baby coming, and it turned out that his daughter was pregnant, and Target had figured it out based on the search terms and purchase history. And so the idea is all of that stuff is available. Everything we do, you have the Price Chopper card, and we say, oh, this is great. I get money off of my gas. They're not doing that to be nice. Right? That is, every time you swipe the card, it tracks what you're purchasing, right? When you purchase things together, and that the whole grocery store is set up. It's a data analytics experiment. Right? What are the
They're maximizing dollars per square foot on the shelf.
Exactly.
Going off her comments, I've noticed on the television news stations, they cover very few different stories. They're all concentrated on the same 3 or 4 stories. Or worse, they repeat the same story from 24 hours ago, and they'll use the word tonight in their description of it. I'm like, no, it was yesterday.
Sort of breaking. I think that's more of the 24-hour news cycle that we're seeing and just recycling content constantly. And I will say it's something, so as we talk about this information overload that is upon us, in many ways it's kind of always been with us, but it's certainly been amplified. I think we keep coming back to this idea that like, at the end of the day, it's never going to be bots or algorithms, it's always going to be us who's going to be the main filter. So I think as an academic librarian, most of what I trade in is critical information literacy. And we're just getting at the tipping point of teaching that in classes and getting students to think through authority and context and the amount of work it literally takes just to figure out what quote unquote the truth is. And as we're riding that wave, and as you just pointed out, and we talk about data, we're now at this crest point of understanding critical data literacy and data privacy. So all these waves keep crashing. I think some of the anxiety we're all feeling in this room is it requires a lot of work to do all of this, and no one was inherently trained to do any of it, us included, of which there's, 4 advanced degrees on this panel? And we just talked about a cup at In-N-Out Burger having Hail Satan on it. Like, that's so I think a lot of it comes back to just, Will underscored it, Meg, Travis, of just like being vigilant and putting in the work and not having clickbait. I will say this, the Twitter study that Will cited of false news or fake news travels faster on Twitter, we all thought it was bots, but when they dug in, it actually wasn't bots. It was sensationalism, but also the novelty of news. So we all, again, this 24-hour news cycle, the only thing that's interesting is that which is breaking or new. And it was us. We were spreading false news faster. So it always comes back to us doing the work, which is probably the most demoralizing thing to learn, students and adults alike.
do one more and then wrap it up?
Yeah. Andy?
Oh, I just wanted to, I appreciated Meg's point on the wanting to understand the rise of subtlety and nuance. I just wanted to give everyone an idea for maybe a piece of homework, which is that if we talked about examples from the Cold War, but there's a lot of good analysis both in the popular press and the scholarly press about the Jefferson versus Adams election and the way that news was covered across the two candidates. And I think if you're looking for a historical case to understand where a lot of this comes from, that we've been with this problem forever, you could go and read those articles. There's great books written on that in all sorts of levels of technical capacity. So I just would offer you to read that. I think it'll make you more pessimistic about whether local newspapers can solve it.
I can carry that further back. Hadrian's Column, which is something that some people have seen, it depicts a war, and it spirals up a column, and it's considered one of the early cartoons because it tells the story of a war. It's fake news. And for a long time, until the 19th century, it was accepted as the story of that war, until some other materials were surfaced by, or were uncovered by archaeologists. And suddenly there was another narrative, and then it took about 80 years to reconstruct the true story and to realize that Hadrian's Column had been lying to us all this time.
That seems like a fitting way to and I want to thank the panel very much. Remind everybody to visit us on Facebook and online at Madison Chenango, the CTA.org. We've got a little donation box outside where, I should say, I think it's a cup today, so please feel free to support us. And we've got some presentations coming up, general meetings that will feature candidates. We've got someone who's going to come in and speak on gun control. And our Ed Outreach Committee is working on a forum on agriculture in New York State and the crisis our farmers are facing. So we'll keep you posted and look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.
Thanks.